In this lecture, we're going to be looking at the young life of Martin Luther. And we're doing this because we want to understand his context and the educational and formative experiences in his life that may have had an influence on him as he became a monk and later as he enacted the initial move of the Reformation. Martin Luther was born on November 10th, 1483. His parents were Hans and Margaret. And at this time, his family did not go by the name of Luther, as he would later be known, but by the name Luda. And Hans and Margaret were of different proportionate wealth from families. Margaret came from a small family that had some means, that was relatively wealthy by the standards of the day. Hans himself came from a relatively low-income family. And we don't know a great deal about Hans and Margaret. We don't know much about their heritage or their lineage. The pieces we do know about them come from Luther himself as he recounts stories of his parents later in his life. But we do have some evidence. Hans was an upwardly mobile worker. Hans left the farms and the fields where he would have had a comfortable life, at least in some respects, but he would have had no opportunity for self-improvement or prosperity. And not long after Luther was born, Hans took the family on a couple of moves in an effort to find better prospects for career. He moved first to the city of Mansfield and then to the city of Eisenach. And in particular at Eisenach, Hans really begins to see some success in his life. Now, that success isn't permanent. He goes through ups and downs. But Hans becomes a bit of an entrepreneur. He gets involved in the smelting industry. And in particular, he works his way up to the point where he is a copper miner. That is to say, he owns several copper mines, and his wealth is therefore dependent on mining copper, smelting it, and then selling it. And again, Hans was relatively successful at this. Within a number of years, he was actually a pretty well-to-do figure in the city of Eisenach. And at some point, he becomes instrumental and involved in city politics. And like so many parents who come from relatively meager means and then work their way up, Hans wanted the best for his son Martin. Now, his dream in the end would be that his son would perhaps participate in the copper industry with him, but he also wants Hans to do better. He wants him to continue the progress of the affluence of their family and the prosperity of their family. And Hans put a great deal of stock into the raising of his son. And in particular, we can see this in the education that he puts Martin through. In the city of Mansfeld and in Eisenach, he makes sure that Luther participates in school. Now, school in this day is not mandatory. Parents have to seek it out, in a manner of speaking. And Hans does just this for his son Martin. And in the educational system, particularly at Eisenach, Luther goes through an educational curriculum known as the Trivium. Now, those of you who are aware of the classical Christian educational movement today will be aware of this word. The Trivium was a system of education, or a curriculum of education, you might say, that focused on the foundations of the three principal subjects that a student would need to learn. And those three are grammar, logic, and rhetoric. Grammar essentially means the grammar of Latin. From a young age, Martin would be schooled in how to speak and read Latin. It was the language of the educated. It was still spoken and written in certain circles in this day and age. And if one hoped to go on to the university or to any further education, one needed a grounding in grammar. Logic and rhetoric would be the application of the Latin language, as a student learned how to think and to argue and to debate. And so Luther had a relatively adequate educational foundation at this point. And so, by 1501, at the age of 19, Luther enrolls at the University of Erfurt. The culmination of his education as a young boy now meant that he could attend the university. And Erfurt was a good university. It was sort of a mid-level, mid-size university, but it was certainly adequate for training of young men. And at the university, Luther graduated from the Trivium to the Quadrivium, which is the foundational intellectual disciplines that one would need to study before they could go on to things like theology or philosophy or the advanced degrees of law. And the Quadrivium is, again, a number of subjects that were seen as the foundation of a good education: arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. These were the four principal foundational subjects that Luther studied while at the University of Erfurt. And one popular misconception we can dispel right now is the one that says that Luther was really not all that bright. This view has sort of lurked out there from time to time. Luther himself liked to affect the idea that he was sort of a blue-collar, low-class guy, that he was not part of the privileged elite, and that he came from a simple peasant lifestyle. And perhaps from that affected way that Luther would sort of carry himself or describe himself, it's sometimes alleged that Luther was not all that good of a student. This is certainly true of people who are critical of Luther's Reformation. They want to say that he simply got theology wrong, he didn't know what he was talking about, and they look to his education at this time as evidence that he was a bit of a fool. But Luther wasn't a fool. He took his BA degree after 1 year. Now, again, let's clarify this. This is not a 4-year collegiate program that we're used to in the modern world. It's not that Luther graduated faster than everybody else per se. A bachelor's degree would be awarded generally when one was believed to have achieved a certain mastery of the subject matter. It was awarded, in other words, based off of the assessment of the professors at the university. Still, 1 year is quite a quick pace, though it should be noted that at the age of 19, Luther was a bit older than many of the average ages that people began their bachelors. Several years later, Luther graduates with his master's degree, his M.A. 1505, he graduates second in his class. Now, again, second in his class does not mean out of thousands, it means out of dozens. But second in his class is a pretty significant mark. Like the bachelor's, the master's degree was awarded when one was believed to have achieved a mastery, hence the name, of the subject material. And so in 1505, Luther has achieved two really high marks, given that he comes from a family that is only recently upwardly mobile. Hans was enormously proud of his son, and it's at this point that he begins to hope that his son will attend law school. A law school in this day and age is the study of any number of certain subjects, and there are a variety of ways that one could focus. There was canon law, and there was civil law. And Hans hoped that his son would study civil law. There were a number of career opportunities that would be open through having attended law school in this way. And should Luther stay close at home, a sound grounding in the education of law would make him very valuable to the family business. And we'll pick up exactly what happened to Luther, how he didn't go to law school, in our next lecture on Luther and the Thunderstorm. But this is the context of Luther's life, a relatively blue-collar background that has moved up in society and rank and wealth, and as a result, Luther has received a fairly substantial education. By and large, these are the facts that we know about Luther's early age. There are some wrinkles here and there that I'm sparing you, but by and large, this is what we know. However, there is one significant issue with young man Luther that we really need to focus on to understand Luther correctly. Prior to the 20th century, Luther really wasn't psychoanalyzed as extensively or as frequently as he is now. Most accounts of Luther began roughly by the time he reaches the monastery, or at least by the time he becomes a professor and begins to have criticisms of the theology of the church. The 20th century, though, is the age of psychoanalysis, and it is to the Freudians and neo-Freudians that we can thank for having to deal with the subject of Luther's young life. Now, there were some Catholic interpretations over the centuries of Luther that had him as a degenerate monk, as a man of slack morals, of low birth, and these kinds of things. By and large, these were simple attacks, sort of defamation of character kind of claims by certain opponents. What shifts in the psychoanalyzing of Luther, though, is really important because it's something that the popular conception of Luther has simply been unable to shake, despite the fact that it's based on very little evidence whatsoever. And the main person to really spark this was Erik Erickson. Erik Erickson was a neo-Freudian. He was a significant thinker on psychology and he was someone who gave the world a number of concepts that are still around today, at least at a popular conscious level. Erickson was instrumental in developing what came to be known as the ego theory, the idea that at a young age, during one's formative years, and he had a certain grid and a certain number of years that he would sort of mark these out. But Erickson said, as one develops, your relationship with your parents is preeminent in forming who you are in terms of your interactions with the world around you in the later life. And he had all kinds of theories for this. I won't go into it. But the two enduring concepts, again, at a popular level, that have endured from Erickson's and the dreaded midlife crisis. Now, the midlife crisis, of course, isn't per se what we're dealing with here, but it has some elements that play into Luther. Erickson, though, in 1958 published a book entitled Young Man Luther, and it was a best-selling book. It was published in a number of languages, and it seeped into the bloodstream of our popular understanding of Luther all of these ideas about Luther's identity formation as a young man. And Erickson's theory goes like this. He looks at young Luther, and he notices, in particular with later Luther in life, that there were a number of evidences of Hans and Margaret being really scathing in their discipline, at least according to Erickson. Erickson paints this picture of Hans Luther as essentially a drunken tyrant, a real awful father, and Margaret was the stern, cold disciplinarian mother with no real tenderness for her children. And in particular, he bases this off of a couple of quotes, and I'll give two of them to you now. Luther, later in life, writes that, "For the sake of stealing a nut, my mother once beat me until the blood flowed." Now, that's all Luther gives us. He doesn't tell us how he reacted to this. He doesn't say how much blood flowed. He just simply says, "I stole a nut and my mother beat me." In another place, Luther says that my father once whipped me so hard that I ran away, and I hated him until he finally managed to win me back. Based off of these quotes and several others and several other evidences about Hans and Margaret, Erickson develops this pretty elaborate thesis that Luther has suffered from an identity crisis, that he has no comfort and no security from home, and that therefore the remainder of his life is plagued by manic depressive neurosis, and that Luther in the monastery and Luther as a professor are unable to cope with the pressures of his day in and day out life. He has no locus of identity within himself that has been formed or shaped by his parents. It is Erickson, too, who gives us the belief that when Luther does enter the monastery and he offers his first communion, that his father Hans shows up essentially angry, unwilling to accept that his son has now joined the church, and essentially at Luther's great moment of his life when he becomes ordained and does his first Mass, that his father sits off in the wings scowling. Erickson carries this thesis on up into Luther in the monastery, and he notices a few places where Luther refers to his crisis of spiritual doubt, the thing that was the precursor to Luther's Reformation breakthrough, as we call it, when he came to a new understanding of justification by faith alone. And Erickson notices that Luther refers to being auf der Cloaca, or auf dieser Cloaca in several other places. Now, this phrase can be literally translated to be, I was in the toilet, or I was on the toilet. And the Freudian in Erickson just simply can't hold back. Here is a man who has an identity crisis. He goes into the monastery during his crisis, and he is constipated. He is anally retentive. Now, it's not my intention to here discuss Luther's toilet habits, but what Erickson has essentially built up is a thesis that the locus of the problem for Luther is not the Catholic Church at all, but rather it's his parents, in particular his father. That his father has so abused him through drunken, angry tirades that Luther has lost a sense of identity, and he has this identity crisis. And that when he enters the monastery, at some point, there is a transference of his problems of authority with his father to the problems of the authority of the church. And so almost written into Luther's psyche is this penchant for rebellion and eventually the overthrowing of the authority of the church. And this is signaled again by the toilet problems of Luther being constipated. Well, what do we make of all this? Without being overly simplistic in my critique of this, and I'm not the only one, virtually every Luther scholar or Reformation scholar of substance has found this claim to be not just problematic, but irksome, because it still hangs about in the minds of students and in the popular consciousness. Well, to quote from one great Luther scholar, Roland Bainton, there are simply grave problems with psychoanalyzing the dead. There are a number of issues with Erickson's comments, the most important of which are his factual errors in historical research. First and foremost, it needs to be noted, Erickson's whole conception of the identity crisis is brought to Luther, and he's looking for it. What's more important is Luther really doesn't abide by the standards of the plot that Erickson gives as the normal process of the identity crisis. Luther's identity crisis arrives late, His midlife crisis arrives early, and these sorts of things. So even Erickson's schema doesn't seem to really hold up. Secondly, there really is no evidence based on Luther's own understandings of his father and his mother that allows us to really describe Hans as a drunken, angry tyrant, or his mother Margaret as a cold, vindictive disciplinarian. What we do have here are a couple of stray comments about Luther reflecting on the discipline he received as a child. Now, it's important here. In order for a child to really find a crisis of what's going on, it needs to be said that it has to be somewhat out of nature or out of joint with what is known in this day and age. Now, we're not making excuses for the discipline that Luther is describing here. He does say that he was beaten, he was spanked. It is certain from the evidence that Luther does not harbor long-term problems with his father or with his mother. The evidence is simply overplayed. Famously, when looking at the issue of the quote where Luther says that his father beat him and I hated him until he finally managed to win me back, Erickson actually gets the translation of this incorrect, and he argues that the case was the other way around, that his father beat him and then his father stayed angry until Luther managed to woo him back through being nice to his father. And he says, aha, here's a father who not only beats and disciplines his son, but stays personally angry with his son until his son manages to make amends. Well, of course, the translation is wrong. It's the exact opposite. It's Luther who's the tempestuous son, who after being disciplined stays angry, and his father, through tenderness, wins him back and soothes his wounded ego. So there's just simply not enough evidence to stand much of the psychoanalysis up on. Also, the belief that Hans Luther remained intractably opposed to Luther joining the church is simply a falsity. Luther's father was angry that Luther had joined the monastery. What he was angry about, though, was not so much the joining of the church, but the fact that he and his father had decided on law school, and that without asking his father, without discussing it with his father, Luther simply abandoned the process and went on to the monastery without really any counsel at all. And Luther's father did write him a letter in which he said, "You have not honored your father. You did not discuss this with me." In other words, Hans is more offended that he was left out of the decision or the discussion, and that his son Martin seemed to essentially run off and join something that was against his father's wishes. Hans is not principally opposed to the idea of his son becoming either a monk or a priest. In fact, that same scene that is so often depicted of his father arriving angry and scornful that his son is performing a mass is eradicated by the fact that his father brought a donation of some kind to the monastery at the first mass of his son. He is blessing, in other words, the stage of life transition of Luther becoming ordained. His father and his mother also lived long enough to see his son become a reformer. They knew him also as a married man. They knew the grandkids that Luther and Katie von Bora were to have later in life. There is nothing throughout these years that indicates a significant and substantial breach of relationship between Luther and his family. And next, and more importantly, all of this stuff about Luther on the toilet, coming to his understanding of justification by faith alone because he's constipated, is simply a myth. Again, this was something that was not at issue with historians, but Erickson almost couldn't help himself when he came to the bit of evidence about Luther having digestive distress while in the monastery. Now, Luther did have digestive stress. He liked to talk about it quite often. He had frequent scatological references and talking about his gas and all this kind of stuff. Luther was a very earthy fellow, let's just put it that way. But Luther does not refer to these things in the relationship to his spiritual crisis that led to his breakthrough. More importantly, the phrase, auf der cloaca, was not a reference per se to the physical outhouse where Luther would go when he needed to relieve himself. Rather, and historians have shown this again and again and again, the phrase auf der cloaca was something of a double meaning. And let me give you a 21st century example in English. If I were to be depressed and I were to say that I'm down in the dumps. Now, let's imagine 500 years from now, someone reading that says, aha, this man is clearly living in a dumpster. He must be homeless at this point. He is down in the dumps, literally. Well, by the standards of today, that's crazy. Down in the dumps is a frame of reference. It's saying that I am depressed so much that I feel like I'm living in the trash heap. Well, auf der cloaca essentially means the same thing. So the several places where Luther refers to his crisis as being auf der cloaca, of being in the outhouse, is scatological, yes, and it seems to refer literally to him being in the outhouse. But it rather means that he is having a spiritual crisis of anxiety, and he clarifies that point again and again and again. It's a spiritual malaise and psychological malaise, yes, but it's not related to his digestive system. Now, if you think Erickson is crazy in this and that why would anyone believe this, that's certainly a conclusion I have. But people do seem to go with this. There was, in fact, a relatively short-running play series on the English stage called Luther, and it was written by John Osborne, a playwright who wrote a number of plays. And Luther is overt in its understanding of Luther's digestive constipation issues, as well as a number of other sort of strange twists in the plot, as being the formative process of Luther as a monk. And this play ran for some time. Even Ian McKellen, Gandalf himself, played Luther at one point. Yes, that's right, Gandalf was Luther at one point. But this play and other sort of popular conceptions of Luther really are dependent too often on this Ericksonian view of Luther. But unfortunately, it just doesn't hold up to the evidence. And the reason that we have to really sort of blow this up at this point is we have to realize that Luther's problems, again, are theological. Now, there's a profound element of his own personal anxiety. But he says again and again and again, it was when he came to a new conceptualization of justification by faith alone that he found himself suddenly letting go of the anxiety and the depression, you might say, that he felt as a man trying to live within the late medieval world. Luther, from the first shot of the Reformation for a number of years, is not the rebel that we think he is. Now, he becomes that. He certainly develops this sharp edge to him where he goes after just about anybody who disagrees with him. But Luther at 1517, posting the 95 Theses, is not a rebel. In fact, in some ways, the Reformation was completely not what he intended. He just wanted to have a debate. And as we'll see as we go through the story of Luther, the Reformation was as much thrust upon him as it was something that he enacted himself. So this idea that he simply started the Reformation because he was mad at his daddy really has no merit, both in terms of the actual actions that Luther takes in 1517 and beyond, as well as in terms of the formation of Luther and all the evidence. Now, I don't believe this one lecture is really going to solve the problem. I do think this problem of Luther on the toilet is going to stay around for some time, and we're just going to have to get used to it on some level. But it is simply without historical merit. In the end, what we can say about young man Luther is that he comes from an upperly mobile family, from a very run-of-the-mill family in terms of the discipline of this day and age, that he received a good education and that he rose up the ranks, and that by 1505, as he is considering going into law school, and as he is sort of pushed and prodded by his father in the hope that Luther would go on to greater and greater success, at some point, Luther's internal turmoil begins to sort of bubble up to the surface. And it bubbles up in such a way that when Luther, on his way to law school, gets caught in a thunderstorm, he has a radical conversion. And so we're going to look at that issue, Luther and the thunderstorm, in our next lecture.